Well, welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Thanks for having me on.
No worries. So, I suppose we should start. How's your lockdown? How's your lockdown been? I'm assuming no one's had a good one, but how's it been?
Now you say that, I've actually really enjoyed it. And that's
All
my
right, that's a first.
my caveat there is I know, of course, it's absolutely terrible and it's changed lives, it's ended lives, it's been awful for so many people. But I think it's really important also that we, when and where we can, we try and take some positives away from this. And for me, it's given me a real grounding. And I've not been in the UK for this long since I was 18. Um, and that's not to say, oh, I'm so privileged. I am very privileged that I've been around the world and I've worked in field work and filming. But actually, to have this time where I can spend hours or even days just making pickles and making jams. And I live on a lovely community-based street where we've got a big communal garden. I've introduced rescue hens for the whole community project.
Okay.
It's me the opportunity to sort of, I'm not going to say the phrase find myself again, but it's allowed me to ground myself slightly.
Yeah.
And I've really fortunately been busy as well. So I've got books on the go and I've got teaching that's kept me going. So
Well,
yeah,
I guess this is perfect for writing, or you'd hope it's because you've just got less distractions and you can crack on with it.
oh, completely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've got I'm quite an introvert anyway. So I think it's really tapped into my inner hermit. So it's been tough. I've not seen my family for a long while, and I've
Yeah.
obviously seen friends. I've got family who work within the NHS, so it's been really tough for some of them. And I know people who've sadly passed away, but equally, I've tried to make the best of it. And I think that's really important for mental health issues as well, to try and see positives where you can and try and see the benefit. So yeah, it's been tough, but I kind of think I'm going to come out of this all right. So I actually weirdly, I'm opening up really quickly to you know, Jack. I had surgery last February. I had spinal surgery. So over the last
Oh.
4 or 5 years, I've increasingly had worse and worse arthritis in my neck. Yes, I know I'm way too young for arthritis, but it was affecting my arm. It was affecting pain. I had all pain down my arm, my
Oh.
throat, my neck for 4 or 5 years, and I'd been on morphine and tramadol, all this stuff. And stupidly, I put the operation off for about 2 years because I was filming all the time and I was in
Yeah.
backwards and forwards, and it was increasingly getting worse. And I'd said to my colleagues, my agent, and my team at UEA, I just need about 4 months off just to have the operation finally, just recover. And people were saying, you can't take 4 months off in 2020. It's a really busy year coming up and all this sort of stuff. But I bit the bullet and said, I need my time off. I'm going to do it. And I had my op last Feb. And you know what? It's been amazing. So it's allowed me that recovery time. I'm doing things I didn't do before in terms of running, in terms of exercise. It's just been, yeah, it is what it is. But hey, it's not been
Yeah.
terrible.
No, I can sympathise. I've got joint problems myself, so no, I can see that. It's slightly, sadly ironic, I should say, if you specialise in bones and then you've got problems with your own bones, isn't it?
You say that I did actually. I way before this, when the problems were setting in, I kind of self-diagnosed what I thought I had, and it was that. And I actually I actually took some. I've got a lot of human teaching materials. I took some human bones to my surgeon to say, "Is this what I've got?" And my poor surgeon's like, "Why have you got these?" It's like
You
I
don't want to
work.
know.
Yeah, you can't. But yeah, a couple of times he did say, "I bet you're really interested in this, aren't you?" It's like, no, I'm more interested if somebody else had it, but not
Yeah.
especially. But I've got a lot of metal work in my neck now, which is quite interesting. So the X-rays are pretty cool. Yeah, I think I'm one of those awkward patients that not only thinks they know stuff, that I probably do know quite a lot of stuff, and it's probably disconcerting for the, for the poor surgeon.
Yeah, that's it. Doctors make the worst patients, or something
Yeah,
along those lines, isn't it? But
absolutely.
as we're going to come on to bones a little bit later on, but the other thing, of course, you're known for is being a primatologist and working with primates. So I wanted to kind of cover one of those facts that everyone seems to know, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into it. And it's when people say that we share 99% of our DNA with a chimp. But what does that exactly mean? If you take 1% away, are we going to suddenly grow hairy and start climbing up trees? Like, what is the? It's one of those
Completely.
things that's thrown around, but yeah.
It's the closest we come is we think it's 98.6% genetically identical. So if you had some weird police lineup with you, a chimp, and a gorilla, then I'm not quite sure what would initiate that lineup. But you and the chimp would be more closely related than the chimp would be to the gorilla. Um,
Ah, okay.
and it's not a case of teasing apart that 1.4% and suddenly you'd be a chimp. Now, what we've both done is we've originated from what we call a common ancestor. So about between 5 and 7 million years ago, there was something that looked more chimp-like, but in that time, we've both split off and we've both become separate species. So you've got the chimps and bonobos, you've got the human group, and within that, we've had the whole Homo range. So things like Homo naledi, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo, all these, right back to Erectus and habilis. But before that, we had the Australopithecine. So we've gone on these weird and wonderful journeys of discovery through evolution. And in that 5 to 7 million year period, we've changed physically quite significantly. But in terms of genetics, it's really only 1 and a bit percent. And that's comparable to a lot of the garden bird species we see in our gardens that are different subspecies, for example. They share even sort of their genetic differences are further apart than what ours are. So in some ways, there's been an argument that we could be a chimpanzee subspecies.
Really? I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, so there was a big debate a few years ago, well, about 10, 20 years ago now, that whether we should be, rather than Homo sapiens, we should be Pan sapiens, which is a lovely sort of exploratory idea. And regardless whether you think we should or shouldn't, it kind of reinforces just how close we are. But so we share so much of our anatomy. I know that I've got a very good friend who worked with bones also, who's also on the TV, and she teaches as well. And she's actually, apparently in the past, has sneakily put chimp bones in with human bones to tease her students and test whether they can tell the difference. And there are some bones that I would be pushed to tell the difference between us and a chimp.
Wow. Wow.
They share, they communicate, they have a rich, complex culture. They show ritualistic behaviors. They have a sense of humor. They laugh. So it goes way beyond just an evolutionary relationship. They are our cousins in so many ways. But it's not quite as simple as, had you changed that 1%, then we would be a different species.
No, and I guess if you do class this as a subspecies, that conjures up all kinds of ethical questions as well about what we do with chimps in particular. I guess,
Absolutely.
Like that.
Well, we've gone full circle already, but the whole the vaccines we're looking at right now with COVID, they have been tested on chimps, because they've been rushed through, and because this is so significant and it's such a serious threat to our species. There's only very, very few situations now where you can test on chimps anymore, which I completely agree with. However, some of the vaccines coming out now have been chimp tested.
Right, and because we're so closely related, presumably if it works fine on a chimp, there's a very good chance it's going to work fine on us.
There's a very good chance, but equally within that 1.4%, whatever it is, difference, there are some really stark contrasts as well. So for us, for example, if we have a common cold, chimps haven't evolved to have the common colds we do. A common cold will kill a chimp within a few days. And even things like paracetamol and certain drugs that are absolutely fine with us. Imagine testing this new drug and it's just paracetamol, but it completely kills chimps. If you never went further than that, then you would never know that it's actually really beneficial to us. So there are, within that difference between us, there are some really marked contrasts, like I said, and I'm not a big advocate of animal testing at all.
No.
Why it's done, but equally there's some real pitfalls there. But yeah, but you're right. There are even some countries now, I think Argentina, I think Spain, who've given them human rights.
Is that right? Wow.
It's weird. It is a really, I like this discussion, but it's a really weird grey area. I think they should be given personhood rights because they are people. They're not human people. But they are more sentient, they're more cognitive, they're more capable than almost any other species I've seen. But this whole ethical conundrum, as you know, saying, so should we put them in zoos? Should we have them in facilities where we're testing on them? What rights do we have when we take away their homes in the wild? I mean, it's a real
it's a rabbit hole. It's maybe a good subject for another day to cover kind of animal sentience, because you could go all the way to things like ravens, which we don't think as being, but they're incredibly intelligent, or even things like octopus. Something
I was going to say, I did an audible series a couple of years ago, and we were recording with cuttlefish. And the woman we were recording with said there's tentative evidence to say they have REM sleep. And that's like mind-blowing, the fact that these things are potentially dreaming.
They're dreaming. Wow.
Yeah. I mean,
what does a cuttlefish dream about?
Exactly. But you just think you're going to get your squid rings from a restaurant, but this thing you're eating is no different to a cow or a thing. But it's effectively just a really fancy slug or a snail. But it's dreaming potentially. And like you say, we go to ravens and the other primates other than us, and even cows and chickens, whatever. That there's a level of sentience there.
Yeah. It is crazy, absolutely crazy. And you mentioned a few of the other kind of the things in between chimps and humans. And again, there's this other thing people talk about in search of the missing link. And I just wondered, have we found the missing link yet, or is there ever a missing link? Is there a case to say there is something missing, or have we mapped it out pretty well?
I was talking about this exact phrase with my uni students at UEA about 2 weeks ago, actually.
Okay.
It's one of those bad terms that we don't. It's living fossils, which we hate, and it's missing.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologise, Ben.
No, no, these are common terms we use all the time, but it doesn't tell us what that is. A missing link means you've got almost everything apart from one or two pieces, and there's almost an overplan. But because evolution isn't A to B to C to D, it's all transitional. There isn't a missing link. There is no such thing as a missing link. I'm looking behind you now, and I can see, for the benefit of listeners, there's a series of photos behind you, and each one's quite separate from the next one. You could go from one, you've got a scorpion, you've got a lizard.
I have, yes, yeah, I've got a few bits up there.
So each one is a separate entity in its own right. But if you imagine morphing that picture into one big thing, and you've still got to find the different things, it's much harder when it's one concept, when it's all sort of blends into one. And where does the puffin end and the dogfish start, or whatever you've got up there? That's what evolution is like. It's really hard to separate this thing from this thing from this thing, because you always get these little transitional bits that flows from one to the next thing. I guess from your perspective, if you were snorkeling down a bunch of streams to try and find a particular fish, it's really hard to say exactly where one stream ends and one begins. We can map that and say it's there, but actually the reality is, well, you've just nominally put that over there, and you are telling me where one starts and one ends. The reality, that stream doesn't care what you say. And that's what evolution is like. It's really easy for us to go, where's that missing link? And it's so much part of the narrative. And we see those t-shirts where it starts with a monkey goes to a chimp, goes to a caveman, goes to us. And we talk about a tree of life where it's a really simple trunk, but it's not. It's more like a tangled rose bush or an ivy bush. Rather than a tree of life. It's a bush of life in that respect. Because even if we talk from, we think from chimps, we don't really know what happened at that chimp-human split. But then about 7 or 8 or 6 or 7 million years ago, we had this upright thing called Celanthropus, which is, we think, our oldest hominin ancestor. And from there, it went to Auroran, and there it went to Ardipithecus, and there it went on and on and on, and then it got to Australopithecines, and then maybe it got to Homo. That's me telling you this lovely linear story, but actually that just reflects what was there at different times. So that one was there at 7 million years, that one was there at 5 million years, that one, I don't know if there's a link between each of those, or we just happen to have found an individual that was there and there and there along this thing. So again, when we're trying to piece together sort of a chronology of evolution with fossil records, especially when there's no DNA, it's really hard to know what came when, and the relationship between those things. So yeah, it's this missing link idea. I think it's because we love a story and we love a narrative, and we love murder mysteries, and we love whodunits. We're always looking for that missing clue, that missing link. Who was the killer? I think we've superimposed that narrative into evolution, which is great because it means more people are interested. But the reality is, there are no missing links because everything kind of flows into one. If I had to find out what made you amazing as a human being, is it the ability to have an opposable thumb? Is it the fact your foot has an arch? Is it the fact that you're bipedal, or that you've got a big brain, or that you've got reduced dentition, or that I could name 20 things that makes you amazing. Each of those things happened at a different part in our evolutionary story. So to tease that apart is really difficult. And I think that's, so it's not a bugbear. It's something that really sort of, as you can probably tell, sends me off into this wonderful narrative.
No, it's good. It's good.
My evolution is so complex, but it's so much more fun when you realize it's not this A, B, C, D linear progressive story. It's more this. It's a bit like Lord of the Rings. If you ever read Lord of the Rings and rather than seeing the films, it's with this wonderful thing where you kind of get in about 4 or 5 chapters. And you're like, what the hell is going on? There's so many characters and there's so many narratives. I don't really know where I am. That's what evolution is like. It's like 1,000 characters all at once in different stories and different places with different agendas. And you're like, oh my God, it's more like that rather than, I don't know, Harry Potter or something, which is Harry and so did this, then they did this, which is a lovely story. but that's more the natural sort of progression of a story, whereas evolution is far more Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, one of my favorite, bringing it to fish a little bit, is one of the facts that I like is if you take, say, a lamprey and a salmon, we're more closely related to a salmon than a lamprey is to a salmon, because they're so far removed, and yet we classify them both as fish because they're swimming around in the sea. So I find things like that pretty crazy.
Completely. I love that analogy. I did so one of my things was a grown-up guide to oceans a couple of years ago again, and one of the best things about that, I went really basic, and I kept asking a lot of the academics, said, what is a fish?
Mm.
And the response kept, and I would ask all these really highly intelligent things that I should be asking at a professorial level and all this sort of stuff. But I kept thinking, I don't really know what a fish is. That sounds really stupid because kids draw fish right from play school. And actually, I got to this level where I'm a university professor, and I still don't really know what a fish is. And it was the one question that everyone came back and kept saying, don't ask us that. We don't really know. It's so difficult because defining it is, again, like we said with the streams a moment ago, it's we have these human constructed designs or concepts over nature, and nature's not like that. So like you say, comparing the agnatha, the things like lampreys with carp, with salmon, with sharks, they're completely different organisms from completely different evolutionary backgrounds. They just happen to live in the wet stuff.
Yeah,
And that's it. It's weird, isn't it?
just lumped all together. It is. It's pretty bonkers there, and that kind of somewhat brings me to bones a little bit, and then we're going to talk a little bit about that now. This is a very generalist question, but what can the bones, when we find an animal in the ground and we see its bones, what can that tell us about that animal? I guess specifically, because if it's animals living today, we probably know a little bit more, but let's take that back to, say, prehistoric animals that we can't see, and we find its bones. What can that tell us about that animal?
So I know this interview is probably going to go out a little bit later than when we're doing it, but as you and I are sitting here now, last week there was a brand new piece of research out saying we've smashed the 1 million-year-old genetic phylogenies. So until last week, the oldest DNA we had was about 700,000 years old.
Okay.
An ancestor of the horse. Whereas last week, a new publication came out, amazing stuff. Mammoth teeth had been preserved up in the permafrost, up in northeastern Russia, right in sort of the heart of Siberia. And because they were frozen, and because these things are massive, sort of 5 or 6 kilos anyways, they act as a time capsule. These teeth had been extracted, DNA had been drilled from the teeth themselves, and colleagues have got DNA that's 1.2 million years old. And so to look at those phylogenies, we now know where mammoths came from. We know how they evolved. We know that the mastodon split in North America with the mammoth split in the rest of the world. So we can start to tease apart those evolutionary stories we were talking about a moment ago. But more importantly than that, if you can access, and you have the skills and the tools and the ability to access DNA that's over 1 million years old now, that completely opens up a whole new branch of studies, from early humans to even fish to birds to just. So from a genetic perspective, bones are time capsules for DNA. They also allow us to look at relationships. So you mentioned a moment ago the lamprey with the salmon with the human link. The same sort of thing applies to things like Dimetrodon. What do you remember these as kids? These weird lizard-like things with these huge sails running down their back.
Yes, yeah, they're not dinosaurs, are they? They're more primitive. Yeah, yeah.
Well, they are, but they're more related to us than they are to dinosaurs. They're part of our ancestry.
Oh, wow, okay.
We can only tell that by the presence or absence of certain holes within the skull. So they, again, allow us to look at evolutionary relationships along the way there. And I guess sort of finally, they allow us to see how species change in changing environments. So we are now going through a radical global change in so many ways with a global ecosystem. And species will change according to that. They'll either go extinct or they'll survive. But within that sort of extreme responses there will be changes within those survivors. And we can see the same thing in the past when you have species on island ecosystems where climate changes suddenly, where their ecology within an environment changes. So by looking at the past, we can predict or look towards the future as well with bones. And again, very often it's one of the last things left. So if you want to work with DNA, that's great. But now we've said that goes to about just over 1 million years, where the bones, we have bones from things that are hundreds of millions of years old. We've got tiny, in fact, we've got these tiny little fish, I'd say fish-like organisms that go right back to the Cambrian, from the Burgess Shales. You're talking 300, 400 million years old, and they were the first vertebrates out there. So potentially our ancestors were swimming around 500 million years ago nearly, and then you and I are sat here today talking over Zoom. So we can somehow follow that story from that little fish-like ancestor to us, and we can see things like our clavicles, our collarbone came from fish-like ancestors. Our jaws completely have evolved from fish structures that we can see within the fossil records. So it allows us to look at processes of change across the evolutionary period as well.
Legacies from kind of each ancestor, I suppose.
Oh, completely. Even
Yeah.
like the position of holes in your skull allows us, as I said with the human stuff, it allows us this hole, the back of your skull that attaches to your spinal column, allows us to look at how the position of humans and human ancestors have gone from these quadrupedal, four-legged ancestors to these upright animals. And you think, so what? Well, we can actually coincide that with a fossil record of climate change, and we can see that as the climate changed, our ancestors became upright. We saw fragmentation in habitats around sub-Saharan Africa, or just the whole of Africa really, and that upright position and that whole new mode of locomotion, we think, was as a response to climate change. So yeah, it allows us to answer some of these big questions as well, just by looking at the bones, but even the positions of holes within bones, the structures of certain things on bones, where you had your extra ridges for muscle attachment. And at one point, when we'd seen a real shift in environmental conditions in Africa about 3 million years ago, one of our ancestors was about the size of a 5-year-old child with the head structure of a gorilla. It was this weird thing called Paranthropus, and the body was really quite small, with this massive jawed skull with huge sagittal crests with massive teeth for this really heavy chewing, but with quite a small body. So you imagine like a 5-year-old with a gorilla skull, and you just think, what's causing that? What's driving that? What's going on there? And you can tease out all this environmental change from a more holistic position just by looking at bones, which is, yeah, you can probably tell I'm quite a big fan of the bones.
I did pick up on that, Ben. Yeah. No, it's good. Have a passion. It's what you need. It's what everyone needs in life. And I was watching a BBC Earth thing on YouTube with you on, and it had you. I think it was showing some of your bone collection, and you had like boxes of bones. And I wondered how hard is it to put an animal together? Because I think, as you say in the film, there's no like kit. There's no like numbers on them telling you which bit goes which. You've just got to, I guess, trial and error to a certain degree. So you've got a skeleton. Like, how do you put it together? It's incredible.
I was a really weird, nerdy child. I'm a really weird, nerdy adult, but as a child, I hated jigsaws. Wasn't really into my sports. I just liked finding dead stuff with my granddad on the beach. And it started off just putting 2 or 3 bones together to see if they worked and how they worked. And I guess that idea of, like you, me, I think anyone who's a naturalist or a scientist or works within this area, we're inquisitive. I think that's the thing that links us all, this why or how or what or when, constantly with the natural world around us. And for me, it was how things fit together within, whether it's species within ecosystems or more individual scale, how animals fit together. And yeah, it was just trial and error. But there is no blueprint, there is no kit to do this. And I guess if I was an X-Men, I think my superpower would be to put skeletons back together. It'd be really crappy superpower, but that's all I got.
I'm not sure how you'd save the world with that, but I'm sure we can come up with some inventive way of you doing that. Are some harder than others? Is there skeletons which you're like, oh, this is a right bastard to put together, or are there some that, or are they all more as much of a muchness?
No, they all come with their different issues. So any of the marine stuff is just an absolute nightmare. Not in terms of the skeleton, the structure, like a whale. A whale is so easy because it's just vertebrae, some ribs, and some paddles. You haven't got the pelvis, you haven't got all these extra bits, all these extra limbs. There's just a real killer to do some of these sort of 4-legged animals, especially. But a whale's easy. However, they weigh a lot, as you might imagine, and actually the bones are really infused with oil. Whereas if you go something like a sheep is easy. The sheep is easy. There aren't many bones. You know what you're doing. You're used to a sheep. You know what the dynamics are. I did a couple of sloths a few years ago for some colleagues who had these bones. They've had them for decades, and I put them back together, and I thought it'd be quite easy. It was so difficult because they've got extra vertebrae in the neck. They've got the whole hand structures. I thought I knew what was going on, but it was just like something off Star Wars. It was just weird. And very often you can put them together, and it looks structurally absolutely fine. But then if you don't capture the normal body position or the behavior effectively, it just looked. I mean, the first sloth I did looked technically correct, but it looked crap in terms of its body posture. So I had to do the whole thing again and rechange it and adapt it. And I'm such a perfectionist with that that when I did it, it finally looked beautiful. But it came with its own issues. So I've currently got, you'll be interested, I've currently got 2 sunfish.
Okay. Mola. That's the one, isn't it? Is that right? Yeah.
So I've got some fish to play with. Now fish are a completely different ball game again because I'm used to my mammals, but even that, as soon as you get away from the mammals, I mean, the reptiles are bad enough. Birds are okay. As soon as I get near fish, it's, what is this? I just don't know what I'm doing. So it's I'll come back to you on that one. So it's you got a whole new process where you can't rot the bodies down in the same. But that's another thing. You've got to rot the bodies down, and that depends on the size of the animal, what the body will do in terms of its response to decomposition. So the way you would rot down a whale, like a sperm whale, is very different to the way I'd rot down my sunfish, for example. I might use domestic beetles for the sunfish as opposed to just sticking a whale on the ground with a JCB for 3 or 4 years. Everyone's got its own absolute nightmare. But I enjoy that. It's good fun.
I sometimes do guest lectures at the University of Nottingham, and I don't know if you've ever been, but they've got quite an impressive collection of bones and different animals there. But they had a pike skull, and that was just incredible to look at because it's not kind of one fused bone. It almost looks like lots of little tiny bones together. It was really weird. So I'll have to find out how they did that because it looks incredible. So I was kind of Googling, can I buy a pike skull? But I wouldn't know where to start with doing all that because the guy there said, "Oh, we've got a load of pike in the fridge if you want one." But I was like, "Well, I can have one, but I wouldn't know where to start."
Oh, I can already tell you. It's something called domestic beetles. So these are carpet beetles, effectively, but they're like carpet beetles on steroids.
Okay.
And you dry the head out. We've gone way too niche here now, Jack. But
all the listeners will be doing this, definitely.
you take all the flesh off you can. So you take the tongue out. You give the brain a good scoop out if you can, because these things can almost OD on too much flesh.
Okay, we don't want that.
So if you ever picked up something by the road, like a dead badger or a dead bird, especially, and turn them over, you get the big carrion beetles, but you also get these tiny little sort of brown fuzzy bear beetles.
That's the ones you're talking about, is it?
They're the ones.
Okay.
You can't find them. If they escape, though, they will eat anything biological in your house. So books to carpets so keep them outside. Make sure they can't escape. Make sure there's biocontrol. So we can do it at universities, for example. But you stick the head in there, and the beetles just clean it all up. Remove all the flesh, remove all the soft tissue. But the nice thing is they don't pull the bone apart. So if you stuck that in the ground, over time, those hundreds or however many dozens of bones there are on a pike skull would just simply fall apart, and you lose the ligaments that hold them together. Whereas if you use these domestic beetles, for example, and then a certain different baths of chemicals to clean it up and degrease it, then the whole thing comes out of one single unit in a beautiful white.
Okay. I'll get back to you on that. I might give that a go.
Check that one afterwards. I can
that might be my lockdown challenge. I might do that. So you've got a lot of skulls, you've got a lot of bones. I wondered, and I should just say so that it's guilt-free, that it's ethically sourced. But if there was a skull or a bone that you could own, what would it be? If it's all above board, I'm not suggesting we go grave digging or anything like that, but anything that you could have. Is there one that you'd love to have? Or maybe a fossil?
You're right. So everything I have that is relevant, I have Natural England licenses for, and it's really important just to put out there that anyone who does collect or does want to collect, you don't take them from animals. You don't buy them off the internet, because very often people have taken those illegally. People have sourced them illegally. If they're CITES permits for internationally sourced things, they're often not accurate or they're illegitimate, and you're basically funding illegal trade. And even within the UK, you have to have license to own so many different things, from bats to otters to anything like that. So make sure you're not doing anything that's either illegal or fueling unethical wildlife loss. However, now I've put that caveat out there. I've got a lot of the things that I never had a list of things I wanted, but I've got in my teaching resources that I've collected over the years. I've got gorilla and chimp. I've got, so because I'm a primate person, I love my primates, which is the worst thing to get bones from. But most of mine are historically sourced from previous colleagues who are academics who have retired or passed on. I've got mandrill skulls. What I like
Oh,
though,
that'd be a good one. The big canines would be pretty impressive.
canines, yeah, and it's really confusing for students when they first turn up because it looks like carnivorous with these huge, massive teeth. And actually, you just say, well, this thing's a veggie. It just eats fruit and leaves. What would I go for? I mean, I love some of the toothed whales. That's it. If I had, what I would love to do, and if my university is listening, I do want to get a sperm whale skull.
Yeah.
I've got a whole jaw that I took from the Inside Nature's Giants whale that we did years ago now. So that's one of my teaching resources. But I would love to have a skull, or even a juvenile sperm whale that we could articulate, hang up, maybe get Nigel Larkin involved to help us put it together and elevate. But yeah, I think a nice whale skeleton would be lovely, just because they're so iconic and they're so reduced, and yet they've still got those wonderful pelvic structures that are there from their ancestry 50 odd million years ago. So yeah, I think a big whale would be quite nice.
Just where would you put it? That's the thing. Is it's a bit, the whole skeleton would be pretty.
Well, you say that. We've got a brand new science building at my university with a lovely atrium that you can walk into and a really high ceiling. So I keep thinking there needs to be something swimming down. In the same way the Natural History Museum has hope, I think we could have glory. So,
yeah, why not? Go for it. I went to a shop in I think it was last year in the Cotswolds, and they were selling like all those fancy stones and stuff. And then they had some fossils, and I thought, oh, I'll have a look if there's anything I can put in my office. And they had a mosasaur tooth, and I thought, I've got to get. It was only like £8 or something like. It wasn't a hell of. If I ever meet you, I'll have to bring it with me because I'd love to know if it's authentic, because I could have just been fleeced. I don't know if that's a good price or not for a fossil. I mean, I thought that was pretty good, but it might just be, I don't know, made out of concrete or something. But it looks real enough. But if I ever meet you, I'll have to bring it along and verify it.
There are some examples of where actual fossils with actual museum curators were conned by people pouring concrete into fossils. And if you've heard of Spinosaurus, this big, there's a relative of Spinosaurus called Irritator, which I love, and it was the South American equivalent. And these slightly dodgy fossil hunters had found this amazing skull and sent photos and told these curators and scientists all about it. And they said, you can come along. We've half wrapped it in plaster, and we don't really want to show it all to you yet. But you've got to buy it. It's by a scene. They're like, oh, okay then. And what the buggers had done is like a cut and shunt. They'd pulled it apart a little bit, added some extra stuff in there to make it elongated, make it longer. And they'd messed around with it so much that when the actual paleontologists had a good look and got involved, they kept just saying it's so irritating. So because they'd messed around and added bits and taken away bits and just basically lied. And this whole thing's called Irritator purely because it was an irritating story.
You've got to have some balls to play around with that sort of stuff, I guess. But I don't know. I don't know. My computer, I'm just going to put the charger, which is downstairs. So sorry, Ben, I'm just going to go grab that because I don't want it to die halfway through. I've only got a little bit left anyway, but I'll just go grab my charger and I'll just plug that in. So just give me a minute.
No worries, not going anywhere.
Sorry about that, Ben. I didn't want to.
It happens.
I didn't want it. I could see it going 10%, and I was like, "No, let's not risk it." Because
it's always a bit worried. It's like, do I leave it? Do I leave it? No.
Yeah, it's sort of like playing chicken, isn't it? And I thought, well, I wouldn't want to waste your time, so we've done that. Okay, right. So I wanted to list some misconceptions about dinosaurs, because I know that's another one of your great passions.
Yep.
Is dinosaurs and their fossils and whatnot. Most of these are probably going to come from Jurassic Park, so you can blame them for any of these things that I'm saying. But the first one is the whole thing about feathers. And I think more recently it's becoming kind of wider and more public knowledge. So did dinosaurs have feathers? And if so, did all of them have feathers? Will be the first one I'll ask you.
So when you and I were kids, and the sort of ladybird books I used to look through, none of them had feathers. They were all these green, scaly, reptile, inverted commas, things that walked around. That concept is completely gone now. They weren't reptiles. They're a completely separate group. And actually the theropods, the two-legged, usually carnivorous dinosaurs, are far more related to the birds, and birds are now classified as theropod dinosaurs. So there is a link there. Now, the idea that that these dinosaurs had feathers did go back quite a way, but it was only really in the mid-late 90s that we had really strong evidence that, how do I word this, that within the theropod dinosaurs, though two-legged carnivorous ones, having feathers was more the norm, as far as we can tell, than not having them. And that's not to say that some didn't. So things like Spinosaurus, for example, there's no evidence they had feathers at all yet. And that makes sense with an aquatic or semi-aquatic hunting dinosaur. Equally, we haven't got any skin imprints yet, so maybe it did. We just don't know, because obviously there are aquatic birds that hunt that have feathers, so we don't really know the answer to that one yet. The most iconic one is T-Rex, and it goes backwards and forwards in terms of the arguments. We have within the T-Rex family tree, there's things like Utyrannus and Tarbosaurus and a few others. Some of those had feathers. We know they had feathers. So we know that some of the Tyrannosaurids were feathered over at least part of their body. As to T-Rex, technically the jury is still out, apparently. I'm convinced they would have been feathered.
Okay.
The next question,
that's everywhere. I mean, I guess you can't know, can you? But presumably that would be most of the body, would it?
Well, even that. So some of the Tyrannosaurs we know, there are bits of the body they didn't. So they wouldn't have had them potentially under the vent and down the base of the tail. They might not have had them down the legs. So you've got to ask also why they had these things. These animals were between 10 and 15 tons, some of these. So that's too big for thermoregulation. Just a bunch of feathers. There's just woods in there. We don't really know why. So this idea that they were completely covered, those big ones, probably doesn't stack up. However, a lot of the small ones were feathered. Now, this is one of the biggest sort of breakthroughs in paleontology in the last 50 years, the fact that these things were feathered, and it's completely changing our understanding of dinosaurs. And to the point we can even have some feathers that are so well preserved that you can actually see banding on the fossils, and using scanning electron microscopes can look at things like melanosomes, these tiny little structures that give our hair its color, for example. And the organization and structure of these melanosomes allow us to predict quite accurately, we think, what color some of these feathers were. And we're seeing things like starling colored feathers, that's really iridescent dark color, to bright red. Some had bright red crests. Anchiornis, for example, was black and white with a bright red crest with red cheek pouches or cheek flares. There was others that had ginger and white stripy tails. So we even know some of these exactly what color they were, exactly what patterns they had. So we've gone from these green scaly things to these vibrant feathered patterned animals that were capable of display and communicating to one another as well. So I think as we move forward the next 5, 10, 20 years, whatever, we're going to get more and more evidence in terms of the technology we have, but also the discoveries coming out thick and fast. So at the moment, we kind of say, well, before COVID, a new species of dinosaurs being described scientifically every week on average. So it's the number of discoveries are just rocketing up in terms of what's coming out there. So for anyone listening who kind of, and I hate this idea that people say, well, science is done, or if you want to do anything new, it's all the big stuff like Mars or whatever. There are so many new discoveries to be made out there. So we are completely in the golden age of discovery right now. So yeah, dinosaurs had feathers. In terms of the four-legged ones, we don't know. Some people think that some of the big sauropods might have been feathered. I just don't see it.
No, okay.
No,
but again,
I'm not saying Diffie.
But we lump them all in again, saying they're all dinosaurs. But again, some of them would be quite different, wouldn't they? Like a sauropod and a theropod, presumably not going to be very closely related at all, are they? So it's not that
No,
surprising.
you've got three main groups of the dinosaurs, and yeah, they're all related. But in the same way you were talking about the fish earlier, and I mean, dinosaurs were around before the 66 million year ago extinction. They were around for about 160 million years, so they dominated the planet. And within that time, as you say, they had these massive radiations and splits. So to call them all dinosaurs is a bit of a generic term again. But yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. And another one, I think this specifically translates to Jurassic Park, and I don't know why I keep mentioning this because it's one of my favorite films, so that's why I'm bringing it up. They do the wrist, the pronated wrist. I don't know if you've come across this before, but the raptors. If anyone does an impersonation, they always go. People can't, because it's a podcast. People can't see this, but me and Ben are now pretending to be raptors. But the wrists are down. So, but in real life, as far as I'm aware, they wouldn't have had that, would they?
No, they were much more hands to face, palms facing one another. If you hold your hands out, like a zombie. That's the way that everyone thinks dinosaurs used to be. But actually, it's if you're about to clap, it's that response. So suddenly these things can grasp, and that makes more sense. If they were doing it for mating purposes, so lots of these animals had to hold on to one another, being quite literal there. Potentially, they were manipulating food. They were using them for a whole range of different things. And actually, if you've got your forelimbs just facing downwards, there's not a huge amount you can do actually, because like a dog, my dog sat next to me actually right now, but his forelimbs just go up and down. They don't really go to the side like ours do. And suddenly, the moment you can pull your forelimbs in, that just it opens up the range of possibilities. Like reptiles, I know they're not reptiles, but similar. Reptiles don't have these little hands that just only go up and down. So why we think the dinosaurs did, and a lot of that is down to early interpretations of those people who put these dinosaur skeletons back together. They'd never seen these things. They thought they were giant animals from Noah's Ark flood, or they thought they were literally giants, like human giants at one point. So it's all very well for us to look back and go, how do they think that? What the hell were they doing? But they didn't know any better, and they didn't have the tech that we have. So I always tell kids that dinosaurs have gone through a celebrity makeover. We always talk about this for the human celebs, but actually the biggest makeovers in history are the dinosaurs. They've gone from these big scaly things that roared with these little hands that went up and down to these brightly colored things that had sort of a whole different morphology. The position of the bodies were completely different. The way they vocalized was very different. So yeah, I think another 5 years will have unlocked even more about these weird animals.
And sticking with the arm theme, and one of the classic ones is like T-Rex and its tiny arms. And I don't know if we know if it's still a mystery what they were for, because a lot of people make there's those T-shirts, isn't there, memes of it trying to grab things, because it's just these tiny and I'll use the word pointless very carefully, but pointless arms. But do we know what the arms of a T-Rex were used for, or are there any theories?
So I love this as well with kids. So they had two massive claws. Each one was about the length of a banana, but about as sharp as a kitchen knife. First of all, and each arm was a meter long outside the body. That's not including more than a meter of shoulder blade that went, or effectively shoulder blade that went into the body. So you've got these quite short but robust arms with two massive claws on the end here. Each one could lift the equivalent of 200 kilos. So suddenly you've got this. My take-home message is you wouldn't win an arm wrestle with a T-Rex, regardless how tough you are. But you're right. Still, for an adult T-Rex that weighs 13, 14, 15 tons, you don't really need this little meter-long thing here. Potentially, these are the different ideas. Potentially, it was for helping them get up when they got off the ground. I don't buy that. It doesn't work with me at all.
Okay.
Potentially, it was for breeding. So when they were really close, there was some sort of mating thing going on. I've not seen anything else that would act that way, and I just don't buy that either. It wouldn't be for holding on like my chickens do, and it wouldn't be like a shark biting bite. I mean, if that did that, they'd use their teeth. They wouldn't use their claws, and they were just too big. Anyway, that doesn't work with me either. I think the most likely answer for me is we used to have T-Rex as this upright thing that was almost like a kangaroo, tail bent on the floor going backwards. That's another thing that's changed massively. So rather than being this like bipedal head directly off the floor above the feet, what we think we've got now is this much more horizontal animal where the tail was lifted off the floor, the head was up. And actually what you don't want is a pair of big arms dropping forward. And potentially, the idea I kind of like is they probably played more of a role when they were younger. So these animals grew incredibly quickly. And by the time they were 10 to 15, they were weighing 10 tons, for example, we think. So that's a hugely accelerated rate of growth there. But when they were little, they needed to get a lot of food in. And actually that huge skull wasn't as disproportionately big when they were juveniles. So it looks as though they were using potentially their forearms, which would proportionally have been more in line with the body. However, when they grew, rather than having these big old hench arms that would pull them down and unbalance them, they just grew at a different rate to the rest of the body. You can't lose your arms, they don't just disappear, but you've gone through a phase where your arms were really important, but actually now as you're bigger, that head's really important. And the one thing that can hinder you is these big, gangly, heavy arms. So actually they're just effectively become reduced in size. In the same way that when you're a human baby, you've got a very big head with proportionate to your body. But as you grow, the proportions change. So if you've got a newborn baby or a 2-year-old or whatever, and you look at that child, if you were to scale it up on a computer next to you or me, for example, Jack, it would look really weird because their head would be about 2 times bigger than us and their limbs would be all disproportionate. You just go, what is that? It's like some weird sort of sci-fi weird monkey human hybrid thing, because we don't proportionately just scale up. And we think potentially the same thing has happened with T-Rex's tiny little weedy arms, which were still kick-ass dangerous.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. That would make sense to me, definitely. I guess because they'd be eating smaller prey and they need the arms perhaps to get in there. I've got one more dino question to ask you, which is, in the first Jurassic Park, there's an iconic scene with the Dilophosaurus in the car, and it spits that stuff on the guy, and it's got a big thrill. But I think, to say it lightly, they took some artistic license with that dinosaur, didn't they?
No. They just completely twisted an animal around and completely lied and made it up. They didn't use artistic license. They were some sort of LSD fueled twist of the truth there. Before COVID, used to do a theatre show for kids about dinosaurs, which I love doing. And one of the questions I used to regularly get was, and it was always said with real solemnity, it was, tell me about Dilophosaurus. And you're like, oh no, the kid knows. I was like, what is it? And I'd always say, is Dilophosaurus one of your favorite dinosaurs? Like, it's my absolute favorite. Like, okay, how upset will you be if I tell you really terrible things about Dilophosaurus? I had one kid cry once. I'm such a monster. And afterwards, his dad was like, can you just tell him this dinosaur had a frill? Like, he didn't have a frill. I'm really sorry. Dilophosaurus was about 5, in reality, between 5, I think it's maybe 5-7 meters long. So it's much longer than the one in the film. Yeah. It was much more horizontal. It was nondescript, and it just had this diloaf, 2 big lumps at the front of its nasal area. So effectively 2 loaves of bread stuck to the front of its face. And as the story goes, that Spielberg said, like, I just need a dinosaur that is, no one really knows what it is, predatory dinosaur. I just want to take a couple of twists and tweaks. And Jack Horn, the paleontologist who was doing all the factual stuff with the film, said, okay, well, Dilophosaurus, yeah, no one really knows it. It's not famous like a Velociraptor or T-Rex, for example. Go mad. And apparently he came back with this tiny frill thing that spat venom. And the legend goes Jack was very much what the hell is that, dude? And this is Dilophosaurus. So yeah, Dilophosaurus was, I think, maybe 5-7 meters long, nondescript. There's no evidence for a frill. There's absolutely no evidence for venom. There's definitely no evidence for spitting venom. Yeah, it's artistic license. I love Jurassic Park, but it's sure as hell not accurate.
No, I know, and it's interesting when you watch the recent films. They try to dress it slightly. They go like, "Oh, we've made our interpretation of it," but without getting into pop culture anyway. That's not what we're here to talk about. I'm going to end on this last question, which of course is going to be about fish. So, sharks and some other fish have cartilage rather than bone.
Yeah.
And again, this is one of those simple questions where I couldn't tell you the difference between cartilage and bone, but for fish, what's the advantage of having a cartilage skeleton? Why don't they have? I know not all fish do. Some fish do have more of a bony skeleton, but why do some have a cartilage skeleton, and what's the advantages of it?
There is, I'm glad you finished on that one, because that comes back to another thing that my students and I talk about. Evolution has no preconcept. It isn't aiming for anything. It isn't trying to strive. It's not a sentient force of nature, which sounds obvious, but I think we often forget that. It's aiming for a better life. It's aiming to be better. There's no rhyme or reason why. And you've said yourself that we're talking so far back that these things split at such a point where they've diverged and they've come up with almost the same solution. We call it convergent evolution. So they've come up with the same sort of solution to a common problem, but they've got different tweaks. So in the same way that we have birds, bats, pterosaurs all have wings, but they've completely come at that from a different perspective. The same sort of thing as we think has happened with those early fish. So yes, they need some sort of internal structure. Some have just gone down a bony route, and some have just gone down a cartilaginous route. There's no reason one's better than the other.
Okay.
People theorize that it might be due to energy constraints. That's not really the case, because you've got really fast swimming makos as also fast swimming tuna. They both got different skeletal structures. It's nothing to do with depth and deep diving, we don't think anyway. Again, it's just two ways of doing the same thing. And then actually, for those who don't know at home, the difference between bone and cartilage, if you wiggle your nose or wiggle the top of your ears, it's wiggly because it's full of cartilage. If you try and wiggle your middle of your forearm, if that wiggles, then please go to your nearest hospital. That's the difference. It's exactly the same materials. There's just different levels of the components within that. If you've got more calcium, it's bone effectively. That's me massively oversimplifying it.
Can you preserve cartilage in the same way you do of a bone? Like, could you have a fish skeleton, a cartilageous fish skeleton?
Can. So some of my, and actually, so you said earlier, what skull would you like? I would love a hammerhead skull.
Yeah, that'd be a good one.
And the local fishing community used to hunt hammerheads in traditional methods. It wasn't nylon line or anything like that. It was all done very artisanally. And you'd very often see a scallop or greater hammerhead head on the beach where we were living, this tiny rural community. And I think I've seen it once or twice. I've seen a hammerhead skull, and they just look, I mean, everyone's going to go Google hammerhead skulls now. They look incredible. But to preserve that cartilage is really, really difficult. It can be done, but it also shrinks. So not only do you lose it, first of all, you've got to preserve it once it's sorted. Otherwise, the whole thing shrinks and becomes really crinkly. And that's part of the problem. We don't have a huge amount of evidence for things like Megalodon. So many kids ask me, is Megalodon still there? This huge shark, it's like 3 or 4 times the length, whatever it was, of great whites. We don't have them anymore. I'm going to put that out there. But equally, the only evidence we really have, there's a little bit of cartilaginous skeleton left, but for one fossil, I think. But most of it is just teeth, because the teeth are preserved really well, but the skeleton never is. They just rot away, they decompose, they're not preserved. So there's a couple. There are very, very few shark skeletons within the fossil record, just because of that. Bone preserves more easily than cartilage. But I always have this joke with the kids at shows. If you were able to jump on the back of a great white, you could probably tighten a knot, because that's made of cartilage. So I did an experiment on TV a few years ago where I took a horse rib and took all the mineral content out, so it's just left the cartilage, and actually turned it into a knot and twisted it. If you made a cartilage, you could be quite bendy and twisty. But I said, if you're ever brave enough to wrangle a great white, try and twist it into a knot, see what happens.
Okay, I'll remember that. If I'm diving with great whites, I'll try and do a balloon animal thing with it and see how that.
Now I just said that. If you've ever seen dogfish, or what they call cat sharks,
yes,
they do tie themselves in knots and they pull themselves. And so there might be some evolutionary advantage that's been selected for once you get it with the smaller sharks, especially that can pull things, I guess. And yeah, there might be some of that there. But yeah, it's quite cool.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Well, look, it's been absolutely fascinating, and I love doing these podcasts with people, and I get to learn stuff, because I didn't know. There's very simple questions that I'd feel a little bit silly asking people, but I'm glad that I did, because I've now learned a ton of stuff that I didn't know before, and it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you, Ben. And as we say, we've not actually spoke properly before, and this is the nice thing with this, that we get to have a natter with people that we see a lot.
Absolutely, yeah, it's been really good fun, actually. I've really enjoyed it. And that, I mean, I always think if you should never feel not just you, but anyone should never feel that that any questions are silly. But some of the best questions are really inverted commas, really silly. And I think any academic or scientist who makes you feel their silly questions is a really crappy academic or scientist anyway. So that's the point of us being here. We're here to help everyone else as well as us understand that a magic, wonderful world around us. The reason that you strip down into your wetsuit and go looking for fish, and that I go to jungles and we do our things, was because we love the world around us. So yeah, it's what we do is trying to promote it for everybody else.
Definitely, couldn't agree more. Well, look, it's been a pleasure, buddy, and take care.
You too. Cheers.